The year is 1978, the office of the director of a large Ural factory. On the wall hangs a portrait of Leonid Ilyich. On the table lies a heavy government telephone. The plan has been fulfilled, bonuses have been paid out, reports have been sent upstairs. But the director, a man of the old school who had lived through the war, sees what is not in the reports. In the third workshop, the machines are worn out to the limit. The workers spend more time in the smoking rooms than at the conveyor belt, and the best turner goes on a week-long binge, and no one dares to fire him. He is irreplaceable. This was the very essence of developed socialism, an era of outward stability and confidence in the future, but secretly corroded by apathy and quiet inefficiency. The system operated by inertia, and its main rule became do no harm, which in practice meant don't change anything. At the same time, in another office on Lubyanskaya Square in Moscow, the chairman of the State Security Committee, Yuri Andropov, was reading completely different reports. These were not ceremonial reports on the implementation of the 5-year plan, but analytical notes from the 5th Directorate of the KGB of the USSR on the mood in society, reports on the real state of affairs at industrial giants, and on the scale of theft and drunkenness in the workplace. Andropov, a man with an analytical, almost icy mind, saw this not simply as laxity, but as a direct threat to state security. He understood that an economy based on false reporting and window dressing would sooner or later crack, and that a country losing its work ethic would become vulnerable. The approach of Leonid Brezhnev and his entourage was based on an unspoken social contract. The government would provide the people with a modest but stable income, and the people would not meddle in politics. This course led to the emergence of an entire generation that had not experienced major upheavals, but also had no great prospects. A measured life, guaranteed employment, free healthcare, and education, all these were the unshakable pillars of the Brezhnev era. However, this facade of calm came at the price of slowing economic growth, technological lag behind the West, and growing bureaucratization, with any initiative from below getting bogged down in endless approvals. Andropov, however, proposed a different path. His recipe was to restore order. While still head of the KGB, he initiated the collection of information on the inefficient use of working time. He knew perfectly well how many engineers played chess at the Research Institute during working hours, and how many employees ran around shops in search of scarce goods. This was preparation for the very campaign to strengthen labor discipline that would unfold later, but its ideological foundations were laid precisely then, in the quiet of the offices on Lubyanka. For him, stability without development was synonymous with decay. He believed that the Soviet system had enormous potential, which was being wasted by mismanagement and a lack of strict control. This was a fundamental disagreement with Brezhnev, who preferred to rely on proven personnel and not rock the boat, even if it was starting to leak. In the early 1980s, an elegantly dressed lady was bustling about in one of Moscow's jewelry shops. The sales assistants fawned over her, offering her the finest diamond jewelry. It was Galina Brezhneva, daughter of the General Secretary himself. Her passion for luxury and precious stones was known throughout Moscow and became a symbol of the hidden but pervasive corruption that had afflicted the upper echelons of Soviet society. She was surrounded by a trail of dubious acquaintances, from circus performers to outright speculators, such as Boris Buryatse, nicknamed Gypsy. For Yuri Andropov and his department, such figures were not just the subject of gossip. They were nodes in a vast network of corruption, the threads of which stretched to the very top. Andropov understood that the rust eating away at the state mechanism had to be fought at its most visible manifestations, but a direct attack on the Brezhnev family was unthinkable. It would have meant declaring war on the entire system that the General Secretary personified. Therefore, it was necessary to act extremely cautiously and secretly, gathering information bit by bit. The investigations initiated by the KGB were conducted quietly. They started small, with the arrest of the director of a large Moscow grocery store or an investigation into fraud in the ocean system, which sold fish and seafood. But each such operation, like a ripple on water, led higher and higher. Those involved in the fish case testified against officials from the Ministry of Fisheries, who in turn hinted at patrons in the party's Central Committee. One of the most high-profile cases was the Sochi-Krasnodar case, which exposed the total corruption of the party leadership in the Krasnodar region, headed by First Secretary Sergei Medunov, a close friend of Brezhnev. Each such step was a challenge to Brezhnev's entourage. This was particularly acute in the confrontation between the KGB and the Ministry of Internal Affairs, headed by Nikolai Shilokov, another favorite of the General Secretary. Shilokov and his department were themselves deeply involved in corruption schemes. Therefore, when KGB investigators began to dig into another high-ranking bribe-taker, they inevitably encountered resistance from the police. It was a quiet war between two power structures, behind which lay a clash of two worldviews: Brezhnev's principle of "we don't betray our own," and Andropov's desire to clean up the ranks. Information about Galina Brezhneva's escapades, Shelikov's abuses, and Medunov's machinations ended up in sealed folders on Andropov's desk. He was in no hurry to use it. This compromising material was his trump card in the behind-the-scenes struggle for power. He demonstrated to the Politburo that the system was rotten and needed surgical intervention, and that he was the only person capable of performing such an operation. For the average Soviet citizen standing in line for sausage, these Kremlin intrigues were far removed. But sometimes echoes of this struggle reached them. Suddenly, a local boss would disappear from his post. A note about certain shortcomings would appear in the newspapers, and rumors about the untold riches of the leader's children would be whispered in kitchens. These were barely noticeable cracks in the monolithic facade of Soviet power, heralding the coming changes. This behind-the-scenes war was waged not only in investigators' offices, but also on the intellectual front. A circle of speechwriters and assistants formed around Brezhnev, whose main task was to cloak the policy of stagnation in euphonious ideological formulas. The concept of developed socialism was their main brainchild, a theoretical justification for why a country that had built socialism was not moving further towards communism. It was an ideology of conservation, of justifying the existing order of things. At the same time, Andropov, having access to unfiltered information, understood that the country was on the verge of a systemic crisis. He began to form an alternative intellectual center around himself. Within the KGB and the USSR Academy of Sciences, closed research institutes were created, which, at his request, analyzed Western economic models, studied the reasons for the USSR's technological backwardness, and sought ways out of the looming impasse. Unorthodox economists and sociologists such as academician Oleg Bogomolov and Tatiana Zaslavskaya were brought in as consultants whose reports, intended for a narrow circle, painted a bleak picture of the state of Soviet society. It was a quiet rebellion by experts against party dogmatists. Unlike many Kremlin elders, Andropov was not afraid of uncomfortable truths. He read Western literature in the original, was interested in contemporary art, and understood that the world was changing much faster than the Politburo was willing to admit. This clash of two approaches was particularly evident in foreign policy, notably in the tragic decision to send troops into Afghanistan in 1979. The decision was pushed through by a small group of people, the so-called Small Four, which included Brezhnev himself, Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, and Andropov. However, their positions were not unanimous. Ustinov, a representative of the powerful military-industrial complex, and Gromyko, Mr. Number of Soviet diplomacy, advocated decisive action, fearing the loss of Afghanistan as a sphere of influence and the emergence of a pro-American regime on their southern borders. Brezhnev, already seriously ill and detached from reality, easily succumbed to their pressure. Andropov, according to many participants in those events, initially took a more cautious position. His department provided the most accurate information about the real situation in Afghanistan, about the strength of the Islamic opposition, the fragmentation of Afghan society, and the impossibility of solving the problem by military means alone. He understood that the USSR risked getting bogged down in a long and bloody war that would become a Soviet Vietnam. However, in the end, he submitted to the collective decision, perhaps not wanting to enter into open confrontation with Ustinov, his future key ally in the struggle for power. This episode showed that even the all-powerful head of the KGB could not always overcome the inertia of the aging and belligerent leadership. By the early 1980s, Leonid Brezhnev's physical and mental condition had become obvious to everyone around him. His slurred speech, shuffling gait, and obvious memory lapses at official events turned him into a tragic figure who was only formally at the head of a huge country. Real power was increasingly concentrated in the hands of the very same Small Four. But even within it, there was a silent struggle. Andropov's main opponent in this struggle was Konstantin Chernenko, head of the General Department of the CPSU Central Committee. Chernenko was the complete opposite of Andropov. Lacking both intellect and broad horizons, he was a master of bureaucratic intrigue and an absolute loyalist to Brezhnev. He was responsible for the General Secretary's paperwork, controlled his schedule, and was, in essence, his shadow. Brezhnev saw Chernenko as his successor, a guarantee that after his departure, the course would remain unchanged and his family and entourage would retain their privileged position. Andropov understood that Chernenko's rise to power would mean the final preservation of stagnation and, possibly, the collapse of the system. Therefore, he began to build his coalition. The key figure in it was Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov. Ustinov, a tough and authoritative leader who oversaw the military-industrial complex, was disappointed with Brezhnev's decrepitude and the inefficiency of the civilian economy. He saw Andropov as a man of action, capable of bringing order to the country and strengthening its defense capabilities, not only with new missiles, but also with a strong economy. The alliance between the head of the KGB and the head of the army was decisive. They were joined by Andrei Gromyko, who, despite his outward impenetrability, also understood that the country needed a more energetic and capable leader than Chernenko. This hidden struggle culminated on the night of 9th to 10th November 1982, when Leonid Brezhnev died at his dacha, Zarechya 6. Only 4 people were immediately informed of his death: Andropov, Ustinov, Gromyko, and Chernenko. It was during these first few hours that the fate of the country was decided. While Chernenko, shocked by the death of his patron, hesitated, Andropov's coalition acted quickly and decisively. Ustinov immediately put the Moscow garrison on high alert, formally to maintain order, but in fact to demonstrate strength and prevent any surprises. Andropov and Gromyko held a series of rapid consultations with key members of the Politburo. The very next day, an emergency meeting of the Politburo was convened. According to tradition, it was to be chaired by Chernenko as the second man in the party hierarchy. He was also supposed to propose a candidate for the new General Secretary. Everyone expected him to nominate himself. But at the decisive moment, when Chernenko opened the meeting, Andropov took the floor. Breaking with unwritten protocol, he proposed that he himself be elected General Secretary. This came as a shock to many, but Ustinov and Gromyko immediately supported his candidacy. Seeing that the game was lost and that Andropov had the support of the ministers of the security forces, Chernenko did not dare to object and was forced to vote for his main rival. The battle for Brezhnev's legacy was won. Upon coming to power, Andropov immediately began to implement the program he had been developing for years. His famous phrase, uttered in a small circle, "We do not know the society in which we live," became the leitmotif of his short reign. The campaign to strengthen labor discipline, ironically dubbed raids on cinemas by the people, was only the tip of the iceberg. The main blow was dealt to the corrupt Brezhnev elite. The Sochi Krasnodar case was reopened, and its main figure, Medunov, was disgracefully expelled from the Central Committee. Yuri Sokolov, director of the Eliseyevsky grocery store, was arrested and eventually sentenced to death by firing squad. But the most sensational event was the resignation and subsequent suicide or murder of Interior Minister Nikolai Shelikov. He was stripped of all his awards and his rank of army general and accused of monstrous abuses. This was not just an act of retribution, but a public flogging, a signal to the entire old guard that the era of permissiveness was over. Andropov attempted to carry out a revolution from above, using methods he had honed in the KGB: tight control, purging of personnel, and reliance on the security forces. He sincerely believed that in this way he could cure the ailing country without changing the foundations of the socialist system. However, his own health, undermined by years of kidney disease, left him too little time. His reign turned out to be only a short, harsh thaw before the final sunset of the Soviet era. This intellectual divide at the top was deeper than just a difference in reports. It reflected the personal qualities of the two leaders. Brezhnev, an energetic party functionary in his youth, had become a man seeking peace and simple pleasures by the end of his life. His interests were limited to hunting, cars, and collecting awards. He loved flattery and comfort, surrounding himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear. Andropov, on the other hand, was his complete opposite. An ascetic by nature, he lived in an apartment that was modest by Kremlin standards, read a lot, wrote poetry under a pseudonym, and even tried to understand jazz, which he considered ideologically alien but important for understanding Western culture. This difference in lifestyle and thinking created an invisible wall between them. Brezhnev saw Andropov as a dry stick and a smart aleck whose constant warnings about problems spoiled the blissful picture of universal prosperity. Andropov, with his analytical mind, saw Brezhnev and his entourage as the main reason for the country's slide into the abyss. The key moment that turned the tide in the hidden struggle for power was the death of the party's chief ideologist, the Grey Cardinal of the Politburo, Mikhail Suslov, in January 1982. Suslov was the guardian of ideological purity and an informal arbiter in Kremlin disputes. His departure created a power vacuum at the heart of the party apparatus. Andropov, who had headed the KGB for 15 years, made a brilliant maneuver. He managed to convince the ailing Brezhnev and the wavering members of the Politburo that he, a man with vast experience and knowledge of the real situation in the country, should take the vacant position of Central Committee Secretary for Ideology. It was a brilliant move. Moving from Lubyanka to Staraya Square, Andropov went from being the head of the Secret Service to the second most powerful man in the party, officially entering the circle of potential successors. He gained control over the ideological apparatus, the media, and, most importantly, got rid of his image as an exclusively strong man. Now he could directly influence the Politburo's agenda, paving the way for his future rise. The fight against corruption reached its tragic climax during this period. One of the darkest episodes, which is still shrouded in mystery, was the death of Andropov's first deputy in the KGB, Army General Semyon Tsvigun. Tsvigun was not just a high-ranking Chekist, he was the husband of Brezhnev's sister-in-law, that is, a member of the family. When KGB investigators in the Diamond case came across Boris Buryatse and his connection to Galina Brezhneva, Tsvigun, according to one version, tried to slow down the investigation to protect the clan's honor. This led to a fierce confrontation with Andropov and Suslov. On the 19th of January 1982, Tsvigun was found dead at his dacha with a gunshot wound. The official version was suicide. However, rumors spread throughout Moscow that he had been taken out. Whatever really happened, this death became a dire omen. It showed that in the struggle for power, the stakes had been raised to the limit, and no one was untouchable anymore. Even family ties with the general secretary were no longer a guarantee of safety. In parallel with the purge of old cadres, Andropov was engaged in the search for and promotion of new ones. With access to the personal files and character references of all the country's party leaders, he conducted his own selection work. He was looking for a new type of person, energetic, educated, not involved in major corruption scandals, and, most importantly, understanding the need for change. It was Andropov who noticed and brought close to him the young and ambitious first secretary of the Stavropol Regional Committee, Mikhail Gorbachev. He appreciated his intelligence, his ability to speak without notes, and his clear desire for reform. With Andropov's support, Gorbachev was transferred to Moscow and became secretary of the Central Committee for Agriculture. Similarly, Andropov noticed and promoted the future chairman of the Council of Ministers of the USSR, Nikolai Ryzhkov, then director of Uralmash, and the future Minister of Foreign Affairs, Eduard Shevardnadze, who headed Georgia. He was creating his own personnel reserve, his future team, which was to succeed him and continue the work he had begun. It was a long game, calculated for decades to come. Andropov's economic ideas also went beyond simply restoring order. He understood that repressive measures alone would not revive the economy. In the early 1980s, on his initiative, a large-scale economic experiment was launched to expand the independence of enterprises in a number of ministries. Factory managers were given more rights to dispose of profits, form a wage fund, and modernize production. It was a timid attempt to introduce elements of self-financing into the planned economy. The intellectual basis for these reforms was the famous Novosibirsk report by academician Tatyana Zaslavskaya, prepared in 1983 for a closed seminar. This report, which had the effect of a bombshell, stated outright that the existing system of production relations was outdated, had become an obstacle to the development of productive forces, and required radical transformation. Zaslavskaya wrote about social antagonisms in Soviet society and the conflict of interests between those in power and those being governed, things that were unthinkable for official Soviet ideology. The publication of such a document would have been impossible in Brezhnev's time, but under Andropov it was not only written, but also discussed at the highest level, demonstrating the new leader's readiness for serious, albeit cautious, reforms. At the same time, it would be a big mistake to consider Andropov a liberal or a secret Democrat. His fight against stagnation and corruption had nothing to do with ideas of political freedom or human rights. On the contrary, as the architect of the modern system of suppression of dissent in the USSR, he sought to create a more efficient, disciplined, and ideologically monolithic authoritarian state. It was under him that the practice of using punitive psychiatry against dissidents reached its peak. It was he who initiated the expulsion of Alexander Solzhenitsyn from the country and the exile of academician Andrei Sakharov to Gorky. In his view, dissidents, corrupt officials, and truants were phenomena of the same order, elements of chaos that weakened the state from within. Therefore, while tightening the screws on the party nomenclature, he simultaneously increased pressure on any manifestation of free thought. His ideal was a kind of socialism with a computer face, a high-tech, mobilized society ruled by an enlightened but absolutely ruthless elite of secret services and technocrats. He did not want to destroy the system but to reboot it, to make it more competitive in its confrontation with the West. This was his personal vision of the future for the USSR, and he was prepared to do anything to achieve it. This invisible front of struggle ran not only along lines of departmental interests, but also along ideological fault lines. Thanks to his 15 years at the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov possessed a unique resource unavailable to other members of the Politburo, an almost undistorted picture of the world. His desk was piled high not only with reports on dissidents and the mood in Soviet factories, but also with analytical summaries from the first Chief Directorate, Foreign Intelligence, on the real state of affairs in the West. He read about the pace of microelectronics adoption in Japan, new methods of corporate management in the United States, and breakthroughs in biotechnology in Europe. Against the backdrop of this data, the State Planning Committee's bravura reports on pig iron and steel production looked like relics from the last century. He saw that the gap between the USSR and its geopolitical adversary was not narrowing but growing catastrophically, and that this gap was technological. While Brezhnev's propaganda branded Western society as decaying, Andropov saw it not only as an enemy, but also as a dangerous and effective competitor. This gave rise to his desire not simply to catch up and overtake, but to borrow and adapt management and technological models. His interest in Hungarian goulash socialism, with its elements of a market economy, was no accident. He understood that the Soviet system, built for the industrial mobilization of the 1930s, was hopelessly outdated in the coming post-industrial era. Hence his reliance on technocrats, on the directors of large defense enterprises who, within the military-industrial complex, were already working to different, stricter, and more efficient standards than the civilian sector. He dreamed of extending the methods of the military-industrial complex to the entire economy of the country, turning the USSR into a single, well-managed corporation. This complexity of his nature was also evident in his attitude towards culture. While being a ruthless persecutor of political dissent, he could at the same time act as a patron to individual artists whom he considered useful or simply talented. A classic example of this was his relationship with Yuri Lyubimov and his Taganka Theater. While the Central Committee's ideological department, headed by Suslov, saw the theater as a hotbed of sedition and demanded that many performances be closed, Andropov sometimes defended Lyubimov through his channels. He understood that the Taganka served as a kind of valve for releasing social tension among the intelligentsia. By allowing it to exist within strictly defined boundaries, he simultaneously kept it under complete control, receiving comprehensive information about the mood in the creative community through his agents. It was a Byzantine game in which he was an unrivaled master. With one hand, he could sign an order to arrest a dissident, and with the other, he could pick up the phone to save an unwelcome play from being banned. But the main factor that turned Andropov's behind-the-scenes struggle into a desperate race against time was his own health. The severe kidney failure from which he had suffered for the last decade and a half of his life was progressing inexorably. By the time he came to power, he was already terminally ill, his life sustained solely by a dialysis machine. Several times a week, he was forced to undergo long hours of dialysis in a specially equipped room in the Kremlin hospital. This knowledge of his own limited time gave his actions a feverish urgency. He did not have decades like Stalin or even quiet years like Brezhnev. He had months, at best a year or two, to try to turn around the giant state ship heading straight for the reefs. This personal race with death explains the harshness and even cruelty with which he descended on the old Brezhnev guard. He could not afford the luxury of lengthy bureaucratic intrigues. He acted like a surgeon who knows that if the tumor is not removed immediately, the patient will die. His campaign to strengthen discipline, the arrests of corrupt officials, the purge of the party apparatus, all this was part of this shock therapy. He created an atmosphere of both fear and hope in the country. The old nomenclature, accustomed to a quiet and comfortable life, was terrified. They saw him as the reincarnation of Stalin, a man who could deprive them of everything: their dachas, their special rations, their power. But at the same time, in another part of society, among engineers, young scientists, army officers, honest factory directors, his arrival gave rise to enormous expectations. They saw him as a leader capable of putting an end to the hypocrisy and senility of the late Brezhnev and restoring the country's lost momentum. Andropov's short reign became an extreme stress test for the Soviet system, which, failing to save it, clearly exposed the depth of its systemic flaws, paving the way for the future perestroika. The confrontation between the KGB and the Ministry of Internal Affairs was deeply personal, almost clan-like in nature. The marriage of Yuri Churbanov, first Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs under Shchelikov, to Galina Brezhneva turned their department into a kind of family business, an inviolable fiefdom protected by the authority of the General Secretary himself. This made Andropov's clash with Shchelikov not just a departmental dispute, but a direct attack on the family, which in that system of coordinates was unheard of audacity. Andropov, however, was a master of the main weapon, information, while Brezhnev's entourage, especially Chernenko, created an information cocoon around him, filtering news and protecting him from any negativity. The head of the KGB was able to break through this blockade. His special files, which landed on the General Secretary's desk, contained the bitter truth about corruption and decay that others preferred to hide, undermining the positions of their opponents. The head of the fourth main directorate of the Ministry of Health, Yevgeny Chazov, became the most important tool in this struggle of the gerontocracy. As the personal physician of the entire leadership, he knew the true value of the health of each Kremlin elder. His medical reports turned into political verdicts, determining who was still capable of remaining in the game. Andropov, who was seriously ill himself, understood the significance of this factor perfectly well and maintained a close, trusting relationship with Chazov, realizing that, in the Kremlin, medical history was sometimes more important than party biography, and that an accurate diagnosis could be a decisive argument in the struggle for power. Although there was no open confrontation between Andropov and Brezhnev, their differences in approach and actions indicate deep disagreements, possibly combining a struggle for personal power with attempts to determine the future of the USSR. For the older and middle generations, this era remains a reminder of the complex political games that influenced the fate of the country. May these facts help to